Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 25th of September of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, a lot of very interesting details, so let's start. First we're going to continue the morning video and we're going to talk about Odessa area, the battle for the Black Sea. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians during the previous night launched significant attack against Crimea using drones, and as we discussed, the Ukrainians were planning to test the Russian air defense or something like this, but that Ukrainian attack was repelled. The Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian air defense systems, and the Ukrainians were planning to launch their Su-24 with Storm Shadow missiles and so on, but the Russians were faster. The Russians were faster, and the Russians, before the Ukrainians launched their Storm Shadow missiles and made their own strikes, the Russians launched Caliber strike and Gerань strikes, and as a result of those attacks, a lot of military infrastructure, port infrastructure, and many other important strategical buildings were destroyed and were damaged on the shore in the vicinity of Odessa and the settlements around Odessa. One of the most powerful damage got the building in port. This is the Hotel Odessa. According to some sources, that building, before the Ukrainians planned to attack the Russian territory Crimea with Storm Shadow, the Ukrainians redeployed in this building something like a headquarters. That the main goal of that headquarters was to control and to complete mission of successful attack against Crimea. The Russians managed to discover that situation, and as a result of Caliber strike and Gerань strike, that building was basically destroyed. Other sources are saying that that building was empty, and the main purpose of the Russians when they were bombing and attacking Odessa was to scare the Ukrainians and not to allow them to attack the Russians with Storm Shadow. Anyway, we see that the Russians managed to achieve a success because we haven't seen Storm Shadow missile strikes. The Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to step back, and they managed to scare them. And this is probably was the goal. The only thing that whether this goal, because it's very expensive goal, because the Russians spent lots of Caliber missiles and a lot of drones, but anyway, the Ukrainians haven't managed to damage even a single ship or submarine as they managed to do a few weeks ago. But that was not the only strikes against the territory of Ukraine. Today the Russians published significant number of videos of long-range attacks, and probably the most powerful video is coming from Dnipro. This video was made by a person from the settlement. He was trying to record the situation, and then the Russians started bombing the city with Caliber missiles, probably with Caliber or Iskander. Significant number of strikes. The author of this video, who was making this video, reported that the strikes took place in industrial area. Industrial area, you know, Dnipro is a very powerful, very big industrial city, and it's not like this industry area was built not by the current Ukrainian authorities, that like old Soviet industrial area with significant number of railways, depots, barracks, and underground facilities, and we see that that was the primary target of the Russians. Some sources are saying that the Russians were targeting not just industrial area but also the airfield, the possible area of possible location of Su-24 or MiG-29 that are able to carry Storm Shadow missiles and to attack Crimea. So the Russians were targeting this area also with the purpose to prevent Ukrainian attack against Crimea, because the Russian air defense, as we discussed, was overloaded and over-tested and overstressed by the Ukrainian drone strike that took place few hours before. Furthermore, the Russians published a video from another airport in the same area, from Kryvyi Rog, the city where the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, was burned. And on this video we see another strike. Very difficult to understand which type of weapon the Russians were using. Maybe that was Gerань, maybe that was Lancet or missile. Anyway, as a result of that strike, another Ukrainian MiG-29 was destroyed. So one more time to understand everything. The Russian air defense system in Crimea was overloaded and overstressed by the Ukrainian drone attack, and the Russians expected significant number of strikes from the Ukrainian side with Storm Shadow missiles, and they really like was afraid of that situation. So that's why, to prevent the Ukrainians from attacking with Storm Shadow, the Russians launched their own massive missile strike against Odessa, Dnipro, and Kryvyi Rog, the settlements, the cities that Ukrainians were using for bases for Su-24 missiles or for Su-24 aircrafts, the carriers of Storm Shadow missiles, and against Odessa shore, the area that Ukrainians used to attack Crimea with missiles like Neptune and S-200, which were upgraded to have possibility to attack from land to land. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. The Russians reported that as a result of bombings and attackings, as a result of artillery strikes, as a result of guided bomb usage and so on, the Ukrainians in this area lost 90 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and 2 artillery D-30. As you can see, according to this video, we have significant number of guided bomb usage in this area, guided bombs usage in this area. The most concentrated area with FAB attacks, with FAB bombings, was the settlement by the name of Lvova. Entire city was almost reduced to ruins by significant number of FAB strikes. We have calculated around 8 bombs, 8 FAB 500 that were used by the Russians in the city. Anyway, we understand that this area has a high-rise building. Probably the Ukrainians were using these buildings for concentration of their forces. Anyway, I expect that very soon the Russians will reduce this settlement to ruins. And this is the number, and this is the videos and the numbers of Ministry of Defense that during the previous 24 hours, 90 soldiers were killed or wounded. And this is probably the heaviest level of losses of Ukrainians in this direction probably since the beginning of this year. I don't remember the numbers higher than this number. There were numbers more bigger, the level of losses were bigger the previous year when the Ukrainians launched their offensive operation, when the Russians were on this bank of the river. Also, the Russians published another video how they managed to destroy a transport ship in the river that Ukrainians were using for redeploying their forces from one side of the river to another. Not like in Dnipro River, there is another river, and on this one. Interesting video we got from Kherson itself. The Russians, probably for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, used FAB 500 against the city. I don't remember when the Russians, whether the Russians ever used FAB 500 against Kherson, but now we got this, and probably the Ukrainians realized that it is very difficult and dangerous to concentrate their forces in these small settlements, and they took a decision to redeploy them in a big city, and they thought that the Russians would not attack the city with the population with FAB 500, but as we can see, the Russians attacked the city as well. Now we're moving to Kherson, to Zaporozhye area, and today we got also a lot of updates from this territory. As you can see, the front line hasn't been changed. There are no changes on the ground. The Ukrainians made few attempts to attack, and I would like, when talking about Zaporozhye area, about Robotyne, I would like to discuss with you a few things. The first one is the situation on the ground in the vicinity of Verbova, and the second one, video that was published by the Ukrainian sources. And this is probably the most interesting video, one of the most interesting video for the previous 24 hours. First, let's start with the situation in Verbova. As we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians probably managed to create some foothold in the northwestern part of the city. We got at least one geolocated video how the Ukrainians were trying to move along the city in the vicinity of that area, but at some point this armored vehicle was destroyed. As I understand, this armored vehicle brought infantry inside the city, inside the settlement, and after that the Ukrainians were trying to evacuate or run away from this area, but they got on minefields or something like this and basically were destroyed. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian infantry who is moving in direction of Verbova, who is heading in direction of Verbova without support of armored vehicles and tanks, and basically this is something like suicide operation to pass these kilometers with one purpose, to answer another like dead zone, like combat zone of Verbova. And this about the situation of Verbova. So no changes, just regular clashes on the ground with attempt from the Ukrainian side to enter Verbova and to start the real clashes and to begin the final phase of assault of the settlement. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in Zaporozhye direction, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers. Now let's discuss another video, and probably one of the most important that, at least for me, explains a lot. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources. On this video we can see something like communication equipment. This like probably some construction, like maybe a water pump construction, not like military construction. And the Russians established on this water pump construction small radar or communication equipment or some very cheap equipment. Very cheap equipment. And the Ukrainians discovered this equipment and they took a decision to destroy this communication equipment with, take a look, with HIMARS strike with cluster rounds. I was shocked when I saw this video. I haven't seen such a event ever, first of all, ever, and not just since the beginning of the special military operation. Imagine yourself, the Ukrainians took a decision to destroy just a regular cell phone, maybe very expensive like iPhone or 15, that was located on the pump station, water pump station, with HIMARS missile with cluster rounds. Significant attack, very interesting, and this is the question about the effectiveness of usage of weapon of HIMARS systems and the Russian systems. Another important thing that I ask myself, why the Ukrainians took a decision to attack this area with HIMARS missile, because it would be much more cheap, much cheaper to use FPV drone for these purposes. For example, we saw a lot of videos in the past how the Ukrainians were destroying the Russian radars and communication equipment with regular FPV drone. As I understand, the main problem is that Ukrainians are lack of ammo. Their lack of weapon, their lack of rounds, their lack of artillery shells. They have some HIMARS missiles. They need to continue offensive operation. They need to penetrate this defense belt, and currently they are forced to use everything they have to get to achieve the goal. Because this is the only explanation why the Ukrainians took a decision to destroy iPhone 15 with HIMARS strike. Or something like this. A very big question, very difficult question to me that I still haven't found an answer. Now we are moving further to South Donetsk direction, and now we are going to discuss the effective usage of long-range missiles weapon. For example, on this video we see a Ukrainian train with a lot of armored vehicles, and the Russians, we have discussed this video in the morning update, but let's take a look one more time. The Russians were using almost the same weapon as Ukrainian HIMARS, Western HIMARS. It's Tornado S system, so it's analog of HIMARS, and this is the effective usage of this type of weapon. Significant number of armored vehicles were destroyed, significant number were damaged, and no number of infantry were killed or wounded, and this is the result. And now, one more time, let's take a look at the video that we saw minutes ago. A cell phone that was located somewhere on the pump station was attacked by almost the same type of weapon, but of Western production, and as a result of that strike, I'm not even sure that this pulp station was destroyed. I'm not even sure, because the building, from this angle, we see that there were no damage to this area. Significant things, of course. Furthermore, the Russians shown another video how they attack another Ukrainian positions with Iskander strike. There was a tree line, and the Ukrainians made operational ammo depot and probably artillery position in this area, and the Russians, as a result of Iskander strike, first destroyed the Ukrainian artillery system. After that, we see secondary detonation of ammo depot in this area, and we see more explosions. So this is very effective usage of long-range missiles. If you remember, a month ago, I told you that Ukrainians did have a long-range superiority. We discussed a lot of videos how the Ukrainians with HIMARS systems destroyed very cheap Russian artillery systems like D-20, D-30. But anyway, we confirmed that yes, of course, the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to move very close to the combat line like M777 howitzers, like crap artillery systems, because if the Russians see them, they destroy them immediately. But the Ukrainians had possibility to use HIMARS against like Russian artillery systems. And we discussed when we agreed that maybe the Ukrainians had this long-range artillery superiority. But after these videos with this train attack and this Iskander strike, I'm taking my words back, and I see that the Russians during the previous months managed to improve their long-range artillery systems, their like positions, and currently it's like obvious complete Russian superiority in long-range artillery systems, not just missiles, also drones, FPV drones, Lancet drones, and so on. Furthermore, if we increase the number of updates from these areas since the beginning of September, we're gonna see that the Russians establish complete control over this sector, the most important sector probably in the special military operation. I'm talking about this area. As you can see, the Russians have established complete control over the main logistic area. The area I'm talking about, the settlement by the name of Pokrovsk, this one. This is logistic hub that Ukrainians use to support at least 3 front lines. First one, Avdiivka. Second one, Marinka Krasnogorovka. Third one, Ugledar. And fourth one is Velika Novoselovka. 4 the main battles are completely depend on this area, and the Russians established complete control over this territory. I'll remind you that during the previous month, just since the beginning of September, the Russians destroyed at least a few raiders in this area that Ukrainians were using for their S-300 and systems, and not maybe even S-300, but a book that Ukrainians have, or Strela that Ukrainians have, or maybe IRST, but I haven't seen IRST on this area. Furthermore, the Russians published video of Iskander strikes. 4 Iskander missiles destroyed a very big base of the Ukrainians in the city by the name of Bogatyr. Also very interesting video. Just take a look. One strike. There was like few strikes, and it's better to watch since the beginning. One strike, then another, the second. Furthermore, I'll remind you that on this area, the Russians discovered the concentration of Ukrainian position of 35th Marine Brigade. That was their temporary base, and that base was completely destroyed also by significant strikes with Iskander system. In the vicinity of the city by the name of the city Rivne, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy the headquarters of 24th Mechanized Brigade, also with long-range missiles. This is the usage of, this is the normal, this is effective usage of long-range missiles. This is how the job is done. This is when we can say that the mission accomplished. The results was achieved by missile strikes. So this is the situation. Now let's remove this number of updates and let's return back to the combat line. So one more time, when talking to Zaporozhye, we have finished. Now let's talk about South Donetsk direction. The Russians continue attacking the cities like Konstantinovka and Novomikhailivka, also using guided bombs, missiles type of Lumur, and those flamethrower systems. The Russians haven't started their offensive operation in direction of these 2 settlements. Maybe there are still Ukrainians, maybe there are still a lot of buildings, but as we discussed, the Russians are very active in this direction, and very soon, sooner or later, this territory will be under very Russian big offensive operation. And we got another video from Ugledar. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian armored vehicles that the Ukrainians armed forces of Ukraine was trying to hide among the buildings somewhere in the tree, but as a result of a reconnaissance operation, that armored vehicle was discovered and destroyed by FPV drone. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery strikes, as a result of clashes in this area as a result of usage of TOS flamethrower systems. As a result of guided bombs, the Ukrainians lost 125 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. But there are no movements on the ground. When talking about the Ukrainians, they also published few videos, but to tell the truth, in comparison with the Russian sources, it's nothing. For example, but this is very important video. For example, in Stara Mikhailovka, the Ukrainian reconnaissance team managed to discover the Russian radar, and using just a regular FPV drone, the Ukrainians destroyed that radar, or not radar but a camera that the Russians were using to control the situation on the combat line. So this is effective usage of the weapon, but not to use HIMARS against this small video camera. I can't even imagine who gave that order. It's even like shame for me how could that happen. Now we're moving further to Klishchiivka and Bakhmut direction. There are no changes on the ground, no movements on the ground. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on entire Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 445 soldiers, 15 armored vehicles, including 1 tank, and also the Russians managed to repel 7 attacks. So a lot of clashes took place in this direction, and mainly most of the clashes took place also in the vicinity of Bakhmut, in the vicinity of Avdiivka. But you know that all those clashes weren't specified, and we haven't received like geolocated video confirmations. Maybe the level of loss of the Ukrainians is tightly connected with the situation in Orekhovo-Vasilievka, because today we got another confirmation that the Russians managed to capture the city, but we yet haven't received even a single video confirmation of that. So for now, I'm still keeping this territory as the territory under the yellow color. There was an attempt from the Ukrainian side to attack the Russian positions along the railways in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, but that attack was repelled and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. So there were no geolocated videos that confirmed the level of losses that was provided by the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. So it's very difficult to understand where exactly the Ukrainians had such a level of losses, such a big level of losses. Maybe the Russians included this explosion on the railways into the report, and then everything can be explained by this video. I don't know. But anyway, sooner or later we're going to find out this. Now we're moving to Kupiansk-Liman front lines. There are no changes on the ground. The Russians made few attempts to continue their offensive operation in the direction of Novoyegorovka. The Ukrainian sources published the video of Russian attack. According to this video, the Russians accumulated around 8 tanks, and probably 40 or 50% of that armored fist was destroyed by the result of Ukrainian counter-artillery attacks, and so on. So for now, the Russians haven't managed to achieve any results, as in distant big results in the vicinity in direction of Novoyegorovka, but they still continue attacking. Maybe they need to change something in their tactics, or maybe they have already achieved success, but we haven't received any updates because of entire situation on Kupiansk and Liman, where the Ministry of Defense is trying to keep the fog of war and not to provide unnecessary, at least secret information to like bloggers, to military experts, and so on. When talking about Novoselovska, today we got another video how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of the settlement, which also confirms that as a result of clashes and Ukrainian counterattacks in this direction, the Russians were forced to step back from some part of Novoselovka, and currently the Russians control again just the railway station and the few streets that goes right before the railways in this area. Furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians took a decision to redeploy some forces of their strategical reserves from Kupiansk direction back to Orekhov area. We remember that the Russians started some offensive operation in the direction of Sinkovka, with purpose to force the Ukrainians to redeploy their forces back, but now the Russians stopped and the Ukrainians started redeployment their forces back to Orekhov, to Zaporozhye, with the purpose to continue those offensive operations. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you, we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.